Let's say welcome to Carl James and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Carl James, obviously, and I'm a musician, singer, songwriter, musical producer as well, for about the last 20 years. 14 of those years I spent fronting a tribute band to The Who, one of the UK's top tribute bands actually. I quite say that quite proudly. So, I've also worked on numerous multimedia musical projects with numerous musicians and bands and things like that. And I'm also a full-time activities coordinator for the elderly. I'm also the author of the Truth Seeker's Guide website. Been going for about 3 or 4 years now. I've written on all manner of subjects there: ufology, 9/11, health, energy, mind control, false flag events, social engineering, all aspects of the global agenda. Recently, I've started specialising in esoteric and secret society and occult symbolism in television programmes and films, amongst other things, but that's kind of tying into what I'm talking about tonight. The Star Trek agenda, and you might be thinking, what bloody hell is he standing here talking about Star Trek tonight? But as this goes on, you'll see that there's a myriad of connections between Star Trek and the global agenda. It really is absolutely mind-boggling. Initially, if I'd have done this talk in full, it probably would have been about 6 hours long. There really is that much material there, but I've tried to sort of keep it at 2, obviously. So. But the inspiration for this really came from my book that I've been writing. About 2 years ago I started writing it, Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda. As Andy was saying about War of the Worlds, Stanley Kubrick, Ridley Scott, George Lucas, they're all there and they're all in that book, and it's staggering. It really is when you look into it. These people and the things that they're connected to, it really does make you think what it is that we're watching, what ideas are being put in our heads. So it's more than just a book about science fiction. It's a 224-page study containing over 1,000 footnotes and reference sources, examining the varied connections between key science fiction writers, producers, directors and the franchises, and the machinations of the global power elite. It encompasses state-sponsored mind control, mass perception management, psyops, false flags, social engineering agendas, human consciousness, secret society beliefs, rituals, suppressed technology, the ET and UFO paradigm. I've got some copies with me tonight. I'll just make the plug now. They're £10 each. I'm selling them at cost. I'm not actually making any money on them at all. That's how much it costs for Lulu, the website, to make them for me and to post them to me. So these connections that I talk about, and specifically to Star Trek tonight, staggering implications for humanity. And they raise many important questions about the subversive nature and the possible agenda of science fiction. I'd say there is an agenda, but here we go. So why is science fiction important? Well, it's always been incredibly popular. Throughout the history of Hollywood, some of the most profitable, I was talking to Andrew about this actually on the way here, some of the most profitable films of all time have been science fiction in nature. If you look, you see that all these films, they really are there. During the last 150 years, some of the most enduring and best-selling works of science fiction literature, science fiction again. Science fiction has impacted, influenced and inspired the careers of many renowned scientists, engineers, politicians and thinkers of the last century. The genre is often cited by alternative knowledge researchers as reflecting many of the subjects indicative of the hidden workings of the global power elite. And this has led some people to consider that some aspects of science fiction may actually be a form of subtle disclosure. And certainly if you look at films like They Live, John Carpenter's They Live, and Stanley Kubrick's 2001, you could make an argument for that to be the case, but not with all of it, I would say. So the question of whether or not some science fiction is truly revelatory is far more complicated when you dig a little deeper. It appears that some aspects of it are plausible deniability platforms, and as Andy was saying about the X-Files, I think that's very much the case with that. I think it was put there for a specific reason at a specific time. Some examples clearly serve an agenda of predictive programming. We've heard lots of people talk about that in fiction and in the media. Irrespective of intent or motive, my research is largely centred on gathering evidence of these connections. So I try to avoid speculating on the why and the who, but and the reasons for it. But it's based on a lot of sort of evidence, connections between science fiction and the global agenda. So tonight I'm going to be analysing the specific period in time in Star Trek history, and I am going to be looking at sort of generically across the whole history of it. But this is one period in the mid-70s. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, he was attempting to create the first Star Trek motion picture. And on the surface, Sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. Yeah. He was simultaneously working for a group called Lab 9, and I'm going to go into quite a few details about that as the talk goes on. And they studied, at least on the surface, and practiced various psychic phenomenon, as well as communication with extraterrestrials or extra-dimensional entities, depending on your point of view on that one. I'm also going to be examining some of the key players collected to this group, Lab 9, and their wider role in the global agenda, such as connections to psychic research, trauma-based mind control, psychotronics, research of chemical, biological and psychological warfare. And take a detailed look at Lab 9's principal guiding force, Dr. Andrea Puharich. Some people pronounce it Puharich, some people pronounce it Puharich. Well, flip back and forwards as the night goes on, probably. I'm going to look at some of the possible motivations of the Lab 9 agenda as well. And in the second part of the talk, I'm going to take a look at the larger overall Star Trek franchise. The possibility that it's a propaganda and recruiting tool for the military-industrial complex and certain scientific agencies such as Stanford Research Institute, I'll come to them as we go on, and NASA as well. Possible promoter of secret society and ritualistic symbolism and themes and doctrines. A promoter of the so-called New World Order ideology, and also, surprisingly, a connection, quite a substantial connection between Star Trek and the 9/11 cover-up as well. So, for those of you who've never heard of Star Trek before, and I doubt there's many, but Star Trek in a nutshell, followed the interstellar adventures of Captain James T. Kirk and the crew of the Starship Enterprise, an exploration vessel of the 23rd century. They're from the Interstellar United Federation of Planets. Star Trek's creator, Gene Roddenberry, based the show partly on the Western TV genre, such as Wagon Train, shows like Wagon Train and Have Gun Will Travel, I think was another one. Also the Horatio Hornblower novels and Gulliver's Travels. So a brief history of Star Trek. Eugene Wesley Gene Roddenberry successfully pitched Star Trek to NBC and Desilu in 1964. The pilot episode, The Cage, was an ambitious effort. It went over budget and it went over the heads of the studio executives. They didn't know what they got in their hands. The story involved a subterranean race of aliens known as the Telosians. They kidnapped the then original captain of the Enterprise, Christopher Pike, forced him to live out his life encapsulated by a telepathically induced illusion of reality in the hopes of repopulating their world. Docile, apathetic behaviour is rewarded and non-conformity is punished. So it's quite a profound idea for 1964. We see that sort of thing going on in the world today. The episode was rejected, but NBC did commission another pilot, which they wanted to be less cerebral and more action-orientated. And the series proper was aired on NBC from September the 6th, 1966. Roddenberry himself remained a guiding creative force for the first two seasons of the series. But by the third season, a chap called Fred Freeberger had taken over as producer, and Roddenberry was bumped to an executive producer position. A lot of people think that an executive producer is higher up than a producer. It's actually the other way around in Hollywood. At the time, he said, "I'm confining myself to administration and policy," and he considered his executive position as a sort of honorary title. Roddenberry parted company with Star Trek soon afterwards. By February 1969, the show had been cancelled. But the show had become very, very popular, and it had garnered a sizable and loyal fan base. And they sought to keep the adventures of the Starship Enterprise alive. There was lots of fan conventions sprang up across the US and across Europe as well, attended by thousands of followers. And many fans became increasingly vocal in their demand for a return to Star Trek, for Star Trek to come back to television. But Roddenberry himself wasn't all that interested in Star Trek. He considered it like a sort of a one-hit wonder, and he wanted to move on to other things. And so he largely ignored the demand for the return of Star Trek. But in 1974, he wrote a letter to two close friends and loyal Star Trek fans, Margaret and Laura Baster. And he said to them that he was in negotiations with Paramount Studios. This was August 1974, and that he would begin writing some new Star Trek material shortly afterwards. At precisely the same time, exactly the same time, almost to the month it was, Roddenberry met a man by the name of Sir John Henry Douglas Whitmore, pictured on the right there. He was a very, very wealthy man, educated at Eton College, Sandhurst Royal Military Academy and Cirencester Agricultural College. He eventually inherited the Orsett estate company at Orsett, following the death of his father. And in the 1960s, he had an illustrious career as a racing driver, British racing driver. He was also a man intricately involved with the Lab 9 group. Whitmore revealed to Roddenberry the existence of Lab 9, and he explained their interest in psychic research, ESP, telepathy, telekinesis, remote viewing, and that sort of thing. He also explained that the group were allegedly in psychic contact with seemingly extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional entities called the Nine, and that they planned to make their presence known to all of humanity in the not-too-distant future. By May 1975, Roddenberry was back in his old office at Paramount. He began writing the story for a $2 to $3 million feature-length Star Trek motion picture. And simultaneously, Sir John Whitmore asked Roddenberry to write a screenplay incorporating some of the more generic aspects and beliefs of the Lab 9 group. And he accepted. And in the book, Gene Roddenberry, The Myth and the Man Behind Star Trek, the author Joel Engel documents how Whitmore made these arrangements for Roddenberry to be introduced to the Nine through their channeler. Whitmore's associate, Phyllis Schlemmer, was her name. First, though, Whitmore wanted to prepare his writer for that extraordinary experience by having him observe legitimate psychic experimentation at universities and research institutes across the country. Part of the arrangement that Roddenberry would witness psychic experiments at Stanford Research Institute. He'd also stay at Whitmore's home in England, and he travelled to the home of Lab 9 in Ossining, New Jersey, which is just outside New York. The latter research facility was based at the property of Dr. Andrea Puharich. Puharich was a key figure in Lab 9. In fact, he was probably the founding figure of Lab 9, I would say. Roddenberry spent a great deal of time in the company of this group. On several occasions, he sat in on psychic channeling sessions led by Phyllis Schlemmer, and the Nine began talking to Roddenberry. And as documented in the book, The Only Planet of Choice by Phyllis Schlemmer, he was spoken to by an extra-dimensional representative of the Nine called Tom. So in mid-1975, Roddenberry's first version of the Star Trek motion picture, entitled The God Thing, was submitted to Paramount Pictures. The story, and it was written partly whilst he was at Ossining at Lab 9, involved an earthbound spacecraft machine entity programmed to send visions of false prophets in the form of Jesus Christ and so on to the people of the earth. This idea of spacecraft, machine intelligence, it crops up a lot throughout this story of Lab 9. William Shatner, he recalled a meeting with Roddenberry where he described the story to him. He said, somewhere out there, there's this massive entity, this abstract unknown life force that seems mechanical in nature. Although it actually possesses its own highly advanced consciousness, it's a force thousands of times greater than any intergalactic civilization has ever witnessed. It could be God, it could be Satan, but it demands worship. That's a very strange story, that is. The script contained numerous subtle references to the Nine, such as a scene where Mr. Spock studies under 9 Vulcan masters. Some of these revealing scenes and references are documented in the 1980 book called The Making of Star Trek the Motion Picture by Susan Sackett, Gene Roddenberry. It's not an easy book to get hold of. Paramount hated the story. They said it was too new age and had an overt anti-religion message to it. But they did give Roddenberry another shot. But at the same time, they began fielding other science fiction writers to potentially write the film. And one of these was Harlan Ellison, who, amongst many other things, wrote the famous City on the Edge of Forever Star Trek for any Star Trek fans, the one with Joan Collins in, if you remember it. The story involved time travel to prehistoric times and a battle against an evil reptilian ET race. Ellison was asked by an executive who had just apparently read Chariots of the Gods, Eric von Daniken's book, if he could shoehorn Mayans into the plot. Ellison pointed out that there were no Mayans in prehistory. The executive replied, "Nobody will know the difference." Ellison exclaimed, "I'll know the difference, you idiot," and stormed out through a profanity-laced cloud. So by December 19th, 1975, Roddenberry had completed his first draft of the Lab 9 script for Whitmore, and he called it The Nine. This was a story of Jim McNorth, the writer and producer of a hugely popular but long since cancelled television science fiction series called Time Zone. In the script, McNorth is approached by an Englishman who represents a group called Second Genesis, dedicated to the study of psychic healing, out-of-body experiences, telepathy and communications with beings on other levels. The story also described a Time Zone movie script proposed by McNorth, but was ultimately rejected by the film studio. Depressed and despondent, McNorth is offered a chance to write a screenplay about Second Genesis. McNorth attends research sessions at Massachusetts Research Institute, sound familiar, where he observes experiments on theoretical physics and telepathy and discovers his own telepathic powers. McNorth eventually communicates with the Nine. He writes his script, and although it's a failure, he lives happily ever after, as these people do in these stories. McNorth concludes that his life was forever changed by those lovely crazies at a Pennsylvania commune. What they made me believe is far larger, far lovelier. I believe I know now that all life is one. We're all part of a wondrous eternal miracle which we have yet to fully comprehend. And I would say there's a good case of art imitating life there, with Roddenberry's circumstances at that point in his life. Whitmore liked the story, but he was disappointed that it didn't contain enough about the Nine's message. Roddenberry's contract allowed Whitmore to ask for a rewrite. He agreed, but strangely he passed the rewriting duties onto his close writer friend John Povell. Povell's best remembered for a television science fiction series called Sliders. The second version of this lab script retained much of the first, but it made the Nine something for the McNorth character to be almost fearful of, with the experience leaving the character somehow questioning his perceptions of reality. This version was immediately rejected by Whitmore. And if you want to find out more about this particular era of Star Trek and that story, I'd check out Joel Engel's book, The Myth and the Man Behind Star Trek. Engels concludes that Roddenberry remained unconvinced and ultimately disinterested in the phenomenon that he'd witnessed via Lab 9. But there is a sizable degree of evidence to indicate that that's not the case. Roddenberry recruited Povell for the Star Trek motion picture project. By January 1976, the pair had written a new script submitted to Paramount. And according to William Shatner, again, what follows is a wildly complicated tale involving repeated time travel, heated arguments with Albert Einstein, Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill and Mao Zedong, clandestine meetings with John F. Kennedy, and culminating in the Enterprise ultimately becoming responsible for World War II. Paramount executives were less than overwhelmed by the story. They didn't think that much of it at all. And Star Trek's future was in the balance at this point. But NASA came to the rescue, and you might see why as the story goes on. They decided to name their prototype space shuttle the Enterprise, after the Star Trek spaceship. And this reignited studio interest in the film. The likes of Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas were approached to direct, but all ultimately declined. Several months beforehand, Coppola used a sizable amount of money invested from his and George Lucas's American Zoetrope company to buy out a San Francisco-based magazine called City Magazine. Coppola used the influential magazine to create an almost pop culture interest around a group of scientists known as the Fundamental Physics Group, originally based at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. Some of these individuals play key roles in the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency ran programs, espionage, e-espionage, heavily subsidized the remote viewing and psi experiments carried out at Stanford Research Institute, and I'll come to some of that in a moment. Many of those involved, such as physicist Jack Sarfati and Ira Einhorn, were also regular attendees of Lab 9, of the Lab 9 group. George Lucas initially expressed a great interest in directing a Star Trek motion picture. He'd long been looking for a science fiction franchise to adapt into a movie series, and they were keen for him to direct, but they were uninterested in selling the whole franchise outright to Lucas, which was what he wanted. He went off and he created Star Wars, some say in keeping with his connections to Stanford Research Institute, the story of Jedi mind tricks and psychic abilities in Star Wars. So the new Star Trek motion picture script was written by British writers Chris Bryant and Alan Scott. Both had gained a degree of notoriety by writing the script for Don't Look Now, Nicholas Roeg's cult film. Legendary producer Ken Adams worked extensively on pre-production storyboards and concept artwork. Adams collaborated closely with Stanley Kubrick on many of his, well, actually all of his films bar 2001, strangely. He also conceived the infamous moon boogie scene, the moon hoax scene in the James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever. Bryant and Scott's script was effectively an ancient aliens as gods narrative, involving the crew of the Enterprise travelling into Earth's past, becoming the ancient Titan gods and teaching mankind how to make fire. The script also explored the esoteric concept of the third eye. Obviously, the story never made it to production. There was a series of events that happened in Star Trek's history at this point. Then there was a proposed television series, taking it from the movie back to television, called Star Trek Phase 2. That eventually fell through. Star Wars became a huge hit at the box office, and the Trek film was fast-tracked again. But because they were limited by the amount of time, they were desperate to get it out there as quick as Star Wars, they used the script for the pilot episode of Star Trek Phase 2, called In Thy Image. The story became mired in controversy when Lab 9 returned at this point again. Seemingly, the script was based on Roddenberry's earlier TV series, Genesis 2, a story called Robots Return. The concept was partly used for an earlier Lab 9-inspired story, the God Thing, the original script. Roddenberry handed Robots Return to the writer Alan Dean Foster. William Shatner described the premise of this story. Here we go again. A high-powered, intelligence-seeking space probe travelling through the universe for hundreds of years, soaking up an immense amount of knowledge along the way. The probe begins questioning its own nature and existence and seeks out its creator. So the theme of sentient AI orbital satellites, repeating again and again, Robots Return, in Thy Image, the God Thing. They all culminated to form Star Trek the Motion Picture. And again, that was about a sentient machine intelligence, V'Ger. And one could argue that Star Trek the Motion Picture, I would argue, that it was Roddenberry's proverbial 5-year mission to somehow realise aspects of the 9 in movie form. Some people say that the Star Trek the Motion Picture and the Lab 9 script were two separate entities, and to some degree that's true, but there's definitely cross-pollination of ideas there, without a shadow of a doubt. So Star Trek the Motion Picture was considered one of the most expensive films for its time, $35 million in total. Studio executives casually ignored the fact that this included all 5 years. It included every version of the script, it included money that was spent on the proposed Star Trek TV series, but it actually made a huge amount of money, generally considered an example of a box office success story, $139 million worldwide. And Paramount treated the film with disdain, and they went looking for somebody to blame, and Roddenberry was their target. But Roddenberry had shrewdly negotiated a franchise contract with Paramount that allowed him to remain as a figurehead of Star Trek, but that really was all it was. According to William Shatner, again, Roddenberry, whose contract forbade such banishment, was kicked upstairs and given the largely ceremonial title of executive consultant, that executive title again. Paid handsomely and allowed to comment on every story, idea and script draft of the sequel films, Gene was nonetheless stripped of his formerly ironclad top dog status. For all intents and purposes, he'd actually been removed from the driver's seat. There's a clip here, straight from the horse's mouth. Straight from Roddenberry's mouth, I should say.
They're going to do a new one. It'll probably be shot on a high-budget TV movie. Then if it has the ability to do it, they'll put it in the theaters or they'll keep it in TV. I'm not going to do it. They will not give me the creative controls I had on the early shows. They will not give me the creative controls I had on the early shows.
Why? That's a big question. He became a man increasingly obsessed, a loose cannon at Paramount. He was fixated with these ideas of esotericism, and stories like that, fringe story ideas. Tested the patience of the studio executives. Despite a whole new team of individuals being drafted in to helm a totally different creative direction for Star Trek the Motion Picture, including the likes of Harve Bennett, Nicholas Meyer, Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner himself as well. Roddenberry was determined to write the story for the Star Trek sequel film. And he proposed a script, a curious one to say the least. Rogue Klingons succeed in stopping the assassination of JFK. By the 23rd century, the Klingons reigned supreme as an unstoppable intergalactic imperial force. Fortunately, Captain Kirk once again saves the universe, as he did, always did, by letting someone die. Travelling back in time, the noble captain ensures that JFK gets his head blown off in Dealey Plaza. William Shatner recalled that the climax of the film would find Spock standing on the grassy knoll in Dallas firing that infamous phantom shot. Yeah. The pitch was immediately rejected, understandably. But what's really strange is he proposed this concept upon the initiation of every subsequent Star Trek film up until his death, Star Trek VI, the last movie. Those who ended up steering the franchise would laugh it off time and time again as Roddenberry's wacky Kennedy idea, Kennedy story. Harv Bennett said, no matter what we'd come up with, Gene would counter by pitching a story about the crew of the Enterprise coming back to stop Jack Kennedy's assassination. Throughout my tenure on Star Trek, that story came up as a substitute for whatever we were planning. Star Trek 2, 3, 4, 5, it didn't matter. Some people say he had a lack of imagination, he couldn't come up with any other stories, but it seems odd that he was determined to get that made. So Lab 9 had clearly stirred something in Roddenberry's creativity and personal outlook on life. Years after the motion picture, Roddenberry managed to get some creative control again via the Star Trek The Next Generation television series. And the themes of the Nine could clearly be seen in that television series. And I'll come to some of that later. So what was it about Lab 9 that held such a sway over him? What had he been exposed to? What did he come to learn from them, from his time with them? To answer these questions, we need to look a bit deeper under the surface of Lab 9. Dr. Andrea Puharich. Henry Carl Puharich, born in Chicago, Illinois, on February the 19th, 1918. Pictured on the right there. Qualified as a doctor and neurologist at Northwestern University in 1947 under a US Army training scheme. Eventually discharged from the Army on medical grounds. In 1948 he established the Round Table Foundation in Glen Cove, Maine. The foundation seemingly studied the likes of telepathy, ESP and other related phenomena. And the foundation itself may well, there does seem to be some circumstantial evidence to suggest this is the case, that it's affiliated with the larger Round Table movement that many of you probably will have heard of. Historically connected to the likes of the Fabians and Coefficients, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Tavistock Institute, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Puharich's Round Table Foundation was subsidised by several global elite figures. The largest contributor was the former US Vice President Henry Wallace via his Wallace Fund. Wallace was responsible for placing the Masonic Great Seal of the United States on the $1 bill in 1935. It's quite a claim to fame, that. Through the foundation and over the next several decades, Puharich made many influential and wealthy friends. Some of these included the likes of Alice Bouvier, daughter of the founder of the Astoria Hotel in New York, Barbara Bronfman, also known as Phyllis Barbara Bronfman Lambert of the Canadian Bronfman elite family, Joyce Petschek of the industrialist banking Petschek family, Marcella Miller DuPont, product of the elite DuPont and Miller families, one Baron de Pauli, according to Lynn Picnic and Clive Prince's book The Stargate Conspiracy, was an Italian nobleman whose wealth came from vineyards, wine vineyards. There was the aforementioned Sir John Whitmore as well. Two close associates were Arthur M. Young and Henry Belk. Belk was a multimillionaire. He eventually became associated with the Rockefeller CIA-funded Human Potential Foundation. Young was the designer of the first Bell helicopter, the Model 30, and the inventor of the stabilizer bars used on many of Bell's early helicopter designs. In the following interview with Puharich, he recalls his first encounter with the Nine. The sound's not very good on this. There has been some subtitles put on it, but I think they've been cut off.
Back in the early 50s, actually about 1950, I was in New York City. I lived in Maine, had a laboratory there, was doing animal work and human work, and Faraday cage and so on and so on. And I was young, I didn't know that much, you know. A lot of brass, but not knowledge. So one of the things that happened was I was in New York City, and I went to a reception given by a very famous lady in parapsychology at that time named Mrs. Eileen Garrett. And she had, as a visiting guest from India, a nice little guy in a narrow jacket and so on, with glasses, and you know, it could have been anybody's uncle. It was nothing conspicuous. And he was very quiet, and we met in the corner, and I asked him, you know, what he does, and so on. He's from the University of Pune, and he's here on a peace mission, and so on and so on. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm studying parapsychology. I'm trying to find out the ultimate reaches of the mind so I can finally design a brain. I mean, that's where my head was in those days, right? And so he said, well, we must get together. I said, how long are you going to be in the country? Oh, he said, I'll be here for about 6 months, and maybe I'll get a renewal. So I said, fine, I'll get together with you. Well, I left them, and other events intervened. 6 months went by, a year went by. And every once in a while I think, gee, maybe I'd call him up, but I didn't. So one day I was up in upper Westchester County area visiting with the former Vice President of the United States. Henry Wallace was a good friend of mine. We did a lot of agricultural experiments together. And we got stuck a little bit on the statistics from an experiment we were running, so I missed the train I was going to take back to New York City. And I missed it by about 2 hours, and I did have an appointment in New York City. So he rushed me to the nearest town, which is Pleasantville, New York, known for Reader's Digest, put me on a train there, and I got on the train, and I sat down, kind of running all day, you know. And the last guy gets on the train, he comes late, and this is Dr. Vina. He sits next to me, he says, oh, he says, time for us, you know, the Indians talk a little high-pitched voice, and say, it's time we ought to get together, right? I said, you know, I guess so, we've been caught up with. Make a long story short, I invited him up to my laboratory in Maine, which is near Rockland, and he came in by plane. One of my colleagues had picked him up. He walked into the house, which is a very famous Stanford White place, huge, and walked into the library and sat down without giving us any warning. Went into trance and started speaking. We are 9 principles and forces, personalities. We wish, and we plan this to the ultimate, blah, 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 blah. And they start telling us about who they were and the history, and that they were interested in helping us to further evolution. Okay, that's how it all got started.
So December 1952, Indian mystic Dr. D.G. Vinod began to channel the first messages of the 9, or the 9 principles and forces, in the presence of Puharich. By this point, aspects of Puharich's work had come to the attention of the military intelligence establishment. He was summoned by the Pentagon to present his findings on the subject of telepathy to the US Army Chief of Psychological Warfare. Coincidentally or not, this occurred a mere month after the creation of the National Security Agency, 1952. February 1953, Puharich was recruited into the Army Chemical Center at Edgewood in Maryland. Edgewood was the hub of US Army chemical and psychological warfare and neurological research in the 50s. I cannot stress the importance of the amount of work that went on there. Top secret projects. Project Bluebird researchers experimented with a variety of psychoactive substances at Edgewood, including dosing over 7,000 military personnel with LSD without their knowledge or consent. The CIA's MK Ultra mind control projects commenced in 1953. Many of the MK Ultra experiments were carried out at the Army Chemical Center as well during the same time period. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MK Ultra, CIA's Technical Service Division, supervised these experiments at Edgewood in 1953. Gottlieb was still the head in 1972, when it gave Hal Puthoff of Stanford Research Institute the funds for his preliminary research into remote viewing. That's what Roddenberry was looking at when he was visiting Stanford Research Institute. Just want to quickly say, if you want to find out a bit more about the nefarious experiments carried out at Edgewood, check out the book by Martin A. Lee and Bruce Schlane. Excellent book, Acid Dreams, The Complete Social History of LSD, the CIA, the 60s and beyond. And in their book, they note about Puharich that he conducted parapsychology and drug experiments for the US military in the late 1950s. 1952, Puharich presented the Pentagon with a research paper entitled The Possible Usefulness of Extrasensory Perception in Psychological Warfare. Puharich lectured the Army, Air Force and Navy on the possibility of using extrasensory powers for mind war. According to Puharich, his own words in his book, The Sacred Mushroom, the paper was submitted on behalf of a group called Essentia Research. The group researched psychic abilities on behalf of the Pentagon, NASA and the Atomic Energy Commission. Puharich once spoke of his involvement with the then top-secret US Navy project from 1948 called Project Penguin. The project studied psychic abilities under the guidance of Rexford Daniels. One project participant was renowned psychic Peter Hurkos. Hurkos was heavily involved with Puharich and the Round Table movement. It is believed that Penguin was intricately connected to the US Navy's infamous and then highly classified Project Chatter in late 1947. And just briefly, Chatter's goal was weakening, if not eliminating, free will in others. The Navy program, which started in 1947, was aimed at developing a truth drug that would force people to reveal their innermost secrets. By the end of 1953, the Korean War had ended and Navy abandoned Chatter altogether. That didn't stop them from going on to other kinds of research. In the book The Sacred Mushroom, Puharich implied that the Round Table was a front for US Army research. According to Lynn Picnic and Clive Prince, Ira Einhorn revealed that Puharich had worked for the CIA during the 1950s. James Hurtak, via his Academy for Future Scientists, once stated that Puharich worked for the US intelligence community. Jack Sarfati once claimed that Puharich worked for Army intelligence in the early 50s. There's a sizable weighing up of evidence there that he was involved. Despite his work at Edgewood, Puharich's involvement with the Round Table Foundation still continued. June 1953, Puharich led a circle of 9 to listen to Dr. Vinod. Shortly after, Vinod parted company with the foundation and returned to India. In April 1955, Puharich departed Edgewood and returned full-time to his work with the Round Table Foundation. The foundation seemingly came to an end in 1958. However, the seeds were sown for Lab 9 at that point. Accounts of Puharich in the 60s are a bit sketchy, a bit spotty. What we do know is in 1962 his research shifted to psychokinesis when he heard of Arrigo, the psychic surgeon in Brazil. Puharich made several visits to Brazil. He's pictured there with Arrigo on the right, in Brazil. It's also in the early 60s that he met with his friend Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, science fiction writer, in Tecate in Mexico. Huxley frequented the Round Table movement in the mid-50s. It should be noted that at the same time as the CIA, Artichoke, MK Ultra, at the same time they were doing what they were doing, Puharich was also investigating psychotropic substances derived from plants found in Latin America. They were in the same place doing the same thing at the same time. Puharich was also substantially researching the effect of ELF waves, extreme low-frequency waves, on the human brain, their effects on the human brain. In 1961, he appeared on a paranormal investigative series called One Step Beyond. Check this out, it's really quite strange.
This member of the mushroom family, this fungus, is for the moment known only as X. It was discovered barely weeks ago growing in a remote rainforest. Science has not yet given it a name, for science knows scarcely anything about it. But it is felt that X might have one remarkable quality, that it stimulates extrasensory perception, enabling the mind to become telepathic and clairvoyant. Now that's a rather large claim. We're in Mexico, thousands of miles from our Hollywood soundstages in a place called Mitla, on the very edge of civilization. Dr. Andrei Puharich, who wrote the astounding book, The Sacred Mushroom. Dr. Puharich's book brought us here in the first place, and in it, he explains how the mushroom seems to have an incredible effect on the power of extrasensory perception.
That our prime mission is to explore and examine the biochemicals present in these new mushrooms and find out if they can be of any benefit in this problem of mental disease.
This is part of the laboratory and study of Dr. Puharich. Are those the mushrooms you brought back from Mexico?
Yes.
Andre, how many people have you tested since you've been back?
You'll be number 26.
What about the results?
Encouraging. The average of the group as a whole, and the series is quite small, you understand, shows evidence for extrasensory perception after taking the mushrooms.
Well, I'm ready. Maybe not as ready as I'm ever going to be.
Well, not quite yet. We have to do some control tests first to see if you have any ESP before you take the mushroom.
Oh, I see.
And these will be done with cards, pictures, and books.
I see.
Now you just sit still there. Now to eat the mushrooms.
All right, I'm ready.
Chew them well when you ingest. Now we'll lie you down on the bed.
What for?
We'll do some physical testing before the effects of the mushroom take hold. Well, it's been about 20 minutes since you had the mushroom, John. How do you feel?
Fine. I feel strong. Sort of, you know. It's kind of hard to... strong. A sense of... kind of sense of well-being. Is that...
Yes. Some people feel that way. Let's try something. I want you to stand right up here in front of this light.
Yeah.
Yes, close your eyes and tell me what you see.
Now I see it. I see so many things I can't tell you. Can't you slow it?
Slow it.
Now I see but I see so many colors that are go
Are they pretty?
in geometric signs that now it's like great things. They're magnificent is what they are. They're magnificent. I have never been so aware of color. It makes me quite dizzy. I feel like I would like to dive into the middle of it. It has a great deal. It has something of power, like noise. I don't know how to translate that into a picture. It seems to have that noise and speed.
You got 6 adequate descriptions out of 8 pictures.
It's a marvelous sensation. It's a marvelous sensation.
But it is. So, in the early 70s, Puharich established Lab 9 at Ossining in New Jersey. Lynn Picnic and Clive Prince described those involved at this point as scientists interested in the interface between quantum physics and consciousness, beside members of super-rich families, politicians and writers. Dick Farley, the former director of the programme development for the Human Potential Foundation, once described Lab 9 as a working network of physicists and psychics, intelligence operatives and powerful billionaires who are less concerned about their source and its weirdness than they are about having every advantage and new age data edge in what they believe to be a battle for the Earth itself. 1971, Puharich discovered Uri Geller, the infamous psychic spoonbender, alleged psychic spoonbender, I should say. During their initial meeting in Tel Aviv, Puharich placed Geller under hypnotic guidance. Geller spoke of a vast entity, a conscious supercomputer located aboard a spacecraft that was heading towards the Earth. Does that sound familiar? The entity identified itself as Spectra. Spectra also revealed that it had programmed Geller with his psychic abilities at the age of 3. Puharich asked if Spectra was anything to do with the 9, to which Geller replied in the affirmative. Puharich returned to America with Geller, who was submitted for psychic testing at Stanford Research Institute, specifically the parapsychology laboratories of Russell Targ and Dr. Harold Putoff. Gene Roddenberry also became associated with Targ and Putoff. No doubt he met them when he was visiting SRI. Organised the experiments he witnessed there, organised by John Whitmore and Puharich. In a letter to Isaac Asimov in 1977, he spoke of attending the New York IEEE symposium on the nature of extrasensory perception, where he met up for dinner with Targ and Putoff afterwards. Aspects of that conference are documented in the book Mind at Large by Charles T. Tart and Harold E. Putoff and Russell Targ. So what was really going on at Stanford Research Institute? What was Roddenberry witness to? Some scenes from a 2013 BBC documentary, The Secret Life of Uri Geller. Strange for the BBC, this one.
So for me, to get to work for the Mossad later on, which I can't talk about what I did, but I dealt with the oldies there. People like Moshe Dayan, a couple of generals, the head of Mossad, and Aharon Yariv. He asked me if I can do certain things, and which I answered to some yes, to some no, and then to the ones that I said yes, he arranged me to execute those requests, and those I cannot talk about. And probably one of the heads of the CIA said, "Get this guy, bring him to America."
The very senior CIA officer who handled Uri Geller's case was Dr. Kit Green.
One afternoon, I got a telephone call on my desk in the headquarters building. And the phone call initially was on what we call the red line. It was a classified line. It was an intelligence agency of a very powerful ally of the United States of America. And they were troubled because a member of their military, an enlisted man, who was doing things for them that they couldn't understand, that appeared to have an electromagnetic aspect, that he was capable of altering highly sophisticated electronics, which included imaging electronics, at will. And they didn't know how he was doing it. At the time, I had a position of leadership in the division that was responsible for life sciences, biological and chemical warfare. So I got the first call, and the question was simply, can you help us? And my response initially was, of course, I'll be glad to try.
And so it was that Uri came to America in 1972. Landing at Washington, D.C., he made his way out to the Stanford Research Institute near Palo Alto, California.
I'm Hal Puthoff. I got my PhD at Stanford University and then went to Stanford Research Institute. Basically, my work was primarily in lasers and quantum electronics.
In 1972, when Hal and I started the program at SRI, we had already, in our previous incarnation as laser physicists, we had both done hardware research for the CIA. We had built things. I had built a laser listening device, which I don't think I'll go into right now, but I'd used a laser to get information from distant places. So I knew people in the CIA, and Hal did also from his early experience in naval intelligence. And in the early 70s, we had done research with a retired police commissioner, Pat Price.
Pat Price caught their interest because he seemed to have astonishing powers of seeing things taking place a long way away. Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff called this psychic talent remote viewing. These experiments seemed to establish that psychics might be able to find hidden people or objects at a distance. SRI's investigation of Uri Geller was initially all about testing his electromagnetics, nothing to do with psychic remote viewing. But his arrival at SRI soon changed the entire dynamic for Targ and Puthoff and the CIA supervisor monitoring their secret research contract.
So what did you do next?
Well, I went and authorized the expenditure of sufficient funds to ask the people doing the research to expand the experimentation under the construct of remote viewing.
Why didn't you publish things like that? Is it because that wasn't replicable?
Well, at the time, it was just kind of a one-off thing, but it was primarily because of direct CIA involvement, and that couldn't be admitted till 1995.
We sent a formal report to the CIA with the Geller data in it. I might even have a copy of such a report here that I could show you. Perhaps I won't do that. I can say, yes, we did. We did report to the CIA in a formal SRI report.
How much do you think it all added up to over the years?
Over the years, maybe $20 million or so. I mean, we ended up having several dozen remote viewers, large catch of people.
We were supported by the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Army Intelligence, NASA, and you see, I'm able to tell you that only because the program has been declassified.
Some of the other people, Targ and Puthoff's SRI research is substantially funded by the CIA via the Office of Technical Services and Office of Research, with additional funding from the US Navy and NASA. CIA funding of SRI's remote viewing research was revealed on April 17, 1995 by Presidential Executive Order NR 1995-4-17. CIA Public Affairs Office statement on the 6th of September 1995 corroborated this further. Puthoff publicly confirmed the connection in a 1996 article for the Journal of Scientific Exploration entitled CIA Initiated Remote Viewing Program at Stanford Research Institute. There is an unaired 90-minute version of the BBC documentary, Secret Life of Uri Geller. It features an interview with former Apollo astronaut, alleged, Edgar Mitchell, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and highlights the connection with Puharich. The Mitchell footage absent from the 60-minute version of the documentary, strangely, and virtually no references were made to Puharich, one brief reference, I think. It's a short section from the 90-minute version, interview with, and I should note the music that you hear at the beginning as well, that's a bit odd. It's a theme tune to Star Trek.
So how did you first hear of Uri?
I was interested in telepathy, psychokinesis, and mental phenomenon and so forth. An American physician by the name of Andrea Puharich called me after I came back from the moon and said, I found this rather amazing Israeli young man who can do these sorts of things. Would you like to study him? And I was intrigued, and I told him, yes, bring him to the States and let's take a look. And then I set out to arrange the testing that we did with him at Stanford Research Institute, where I met Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. What I did not know at the time was that the work at SRI was also being funded by our CIA, and only discovered that later. As we finished our work with Uri at SRI, I was called by the head of the CIA and asked to come to Washington and brief him on what we had learned. And that head happened to be George H.W. Bush. He was head of the CIA at that point in time, and it turned out that it was all a part of the same big study. The Russians were studying it, we were studying it, the CIA was studying it, I was studying it, and so it was all a part of the so-called study of parapsychology. I didn't know at that time all the work that the CIA was involved in.
You didn't know. Edgar Mitchell was Uri Geller's case officer during his psychic testing at SRI. Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, co-founded by Mitchell and investor Paul N. Temple in March 1973. According to their official publicity, IONS was and still is an organisation dedicated to all aspects of the human potentials movement. IONS were heavily involved with the remote viewing programme at SRI. By their own admission, substantially funded Uri Geller's time at SRI. Even though Mitchell tries very, very hard there to say that we didn't know the CIA was involved, we didn't brief George Bush until afterwards. In his 1996 book, The Way of the Explorer, Mitchell revealed that he regularly briefed the then head of the CIA, George Bush Sr., during the research. IONS only claimed that they had funded the Geller research after it was revealed that the CIA had initiated the research at Stanford Research Institute. For all of Mitchell's protestations about his associations with the CIA, the question must be asked, just how connected is the CIA and IONS, by extension Mitchell's? Institute of Noetic Science seemingly obsessed with research into and apparently the suppression of free energy technology. Edgar Mitchell once made a paltry offer to buy out a device created by Bruce De Palma, brother of the noted Hollywood film director Brian De Palma. De Palma's N machine was a free energy device similar in principle to over Unity technology. Mitchell, upon having his paltry offer turned down by De Palma, allegedly told De Palma, if you're going to go around doing this sort of thing in California, you are going to get your head blown off. De Palma claimed that IONS was probably a shell company for the CIA, presumably to keep tabs on those people who were highly creative, talented, and used their knowledge to develop advanced technology that was independent of the mainstream system. De Palma died under very suspicious circumstances in 1997. So, Geller's time, his discontinuity, his tenure with Lab 9. He's maintained that he was done with Stanford Research Institute by 1974, and actually by extension he said he was pretty much done with Puharich at that point as well. But he subsequently went on to pursue a celebrity lifestyle, but it's known that follow-up tests were conducted on Geller in 1974 through to 1975 in the UK, supervised by Jack Sarfati and Brendan O'Regan, both frequenters of Lab 9. One session took place at Birkbeck College, London, on June the 21st and 22nd, 1974, and was attended by the likes of David Bohm, Arthur Koestler, and Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer. At the time, Brendan O'Regan was the research director of Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences and a consultant for SRI. Despite Geller's insistence that he was at this point no longer involved with Andrea Puharich's research and by extension Lab 9, Jack Sarfati, who was closely involved with SRI as well, recalled meeting with Geller, Puharich and Sir John Whitmore following the Birkbeck College sessions. Jack Sarfati once made some telling remarks about his time with Puharich, Geller and the Nine. He said, "I was then, 1973, simply a young, inexperienced, naive idiot in a very, very sophisticated and successful psychological warfare operation run by the late Brendan O'Regan of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the late Harold Chipman, who was the CIA station chief responsible for all mind control research in the Bay Area in the 1970s. It's interesting. Jack Sarfati, aforementioned member of the Fundamental Physics Group, pictured on the right there in his lovely little smock. Originally based at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, his article, The Merry Prankster Physicists, John Gribben described the group as young scientists dabbling in mind-altering drugs as they search for a quantum physics-based explanation for such phenomena as telepathy and extrasensory perception. Puharich considered Sarfati gifted and carried out various psi tests on him at Lab 9. And Sarfati has also maintained that in 1952 he received a telephone call from a machine-like voice claiming to be a vast AI consciousness located on a spaceship from the future. Strange how this seemingly occurred at the same time as Dr. Vinode's first channeled messages from the Nine. It's even more curious that it mirrors Geller's contact with Spectra and Roddenberry's early Star Trek movie narratives. So briefly, this idea of non-terrestrial satellites, AI intelligence and that sort of thing. Communication with the ET satellites appeared throughout the history of ufology. Donald Kehoe once wrote about artificial satellites, claiming that in the 1950s, one or two of these objects orbited the Earth. In 1954, researcher Wilbert Smith studied the accounts of Francis Swan, an alleged ET contactee. Swan contacted the US government regarding two mysterious satellites, which seemingly orbited the Earth throughout 1953 and 1954. Again, synchronicity of the same time period. Sarfati, Dr. Vinode, possibly. So, people consider alternative origins of the Nine's message. I mean, there may be an extraterrestrial aspect to it, but there are other phenomena. I do believe that there is some legitimacy to many extraterrestrial claims and the phenomena such as remote viewing, telepathy, and that sort of thing as well. Not all, but a lot. Some things we should consider. It gives us an alternative take on the Lab 9 message. According to researcher Alex Constantine, in his article, Andrea Puharich, the CIA Mystic, recent research has revealed Puharich to have a distinctly sinister side. As an army doctor in the 1950s, he was deeply involved with the CIA's notorious MK-Ultra mind control project. He, together with the infamous Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, experimented with a variety of techniques to change or induce actual thought processes, even to creating the impressions of voices in the head. These techniques include the use of drugs, hypnosis, and beaming radio signals directly into a subject's brain. Significantly, he was engaged in this work at exactly the same time that the Nine made their first appearance at the Round Table Foundation. The foundation itself is now known to have been largely funded by the Pentagon as a front for its medical and parapsychological research. Puharich was still working for the CIA in the early 1970s. That's summed up there. So much of his work at Lab 9, Puharich's work, also involves studying electrobiology and the use of a specially constructed Faraday cage, a metallic enclosure that prevents the entry or escape of electromagnetic fields. Some accounts of alleged trauma-based mind control programming cite the use of Faraday cage-like devices and electricity. Check out Kathy O'Brien and Bryce Taylor's accounts on that one. According to researcher James David Manning, in 1951, Puharich received a research grant of close to $100,000 from the US military to build a solid sheet metal Faraday cage to test psychics who were worthy of study. The research involved studying individuals with above prescience levels of psychic abilities, particularly so-called gifted or special children and adults. Well, that is interesting that term often crops up in trauma-based mind control as well, this idea of special, you're special. Researcher Colin Wilson spoke to Puharich about the Space Kids shortly before his death. Not long before Andrea Puharich's death, I was asked to write an article about him and rang his home in America. When I asked him about what he was working on, he told me he was working on the study of supernormal children. You wouldn't believe how many of these kids are out there. They seem to be on a genius level. I know dozens, and there are probably thousands. Another synchronicity maybe. In the script for the Lab 9, Gene Roddenberry described a cage used by the thinly veiled Lab 9 cipher Second Genesis. He called it a 10-foot square chamber built of copper and filled with sophisticated electronic equipment. This is where a channeler communicates with the 9. Why is a psychic channeler communicating inside a Faraday cage? Roddenberry witnessed some of these Parrige's experiments with space kids throughout the latter part of 1975. So this idea of possibility of trauma-based mind control, a number of individuals have made the claim, and they've said that they've suffered as a result of Parrige's research. Most notable account of these come from a once quiet and unassuming girl called Belita Adair. Parrige described her as one of the greatest mediums of all time. She was studied at SRI and UCLA, the latter by Dr. Thelma Moss in 1975. Adair once recalled the traumatic experience of being tested by Parrige in January and February 1977. She said, I underwent these horrible psychic tests locked in that Faraday cage in Ossining, New York, where parapsychologist Dr. Andrea Parrige conducted hours of research on me, turning off almost all of the air in the cage and moving electrical currents. Under his helm, he kept pumping me to obtain the knowledge he wanted. He was after things like atomic numbers and stuff like that, strange stuff. She claimed that it significantly affected her health, personality and appearance. She ultimately became a musician with a black metal project called Satanic Corpse. There's a picture of her at the bottom there. It's about the tamest picture I could find of her. But she has been able to back up a lot of her claims. She's got a substantial amount of handwritten letters, post-dated, handwriting signed by Andrea Parrige, backwards and forwards. So she's, there's a fair bit of evidence to back up her claims. NASA astronaut Gordon Cooper hinted at a sinister side to the Space Kids phenomenon. According to mind control researcher James David Manning in his article, NASA, Star Kids and the Mind Control Merchant, he said Cooper stated unequivocally that NASA administrated a mind control program involving school children called Space Kids. He said that the program was run through an MK program. Strong direct eyewitness testimony from events that he personally observed. He was in a special and unique position within NASA to know. And in his book, Leap of Faith, he actually identified Parrige as the person responsible for developing NASA's Space Kids project. Cooper befriended Parrige, witnessed aspects of the Faraday cage experiments at Ossining. Cooper was approached by an assistant to Parrige, Valerie Ranson, to develop the NASA Space Kids project. Ranson needed Cooper's help and contacts to create a network of highly influential individuals and scientists that would be known as the Advanced Technology Group. However, it appeared that group actually existed at the Foreign Technology Division of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. I think it was Dale A. Graff ended up working on Project Stargate, that remote viewing. About 20 years, I think he headed up that project. 1977, Parrige had become increasingly obsessed with EMF and ELF wave transmissions and experiments, particularly the effect on human psychology and physiology. He even began to speak publicly about the subject, and in some of his research, he decided to write a book about Nikola Tesla, entitled TMT, The Magnetic Threat. According to Andrea's second wife, Bette Hermans, in her book Memories of a Maverick, this had dire consequences. August 7th, 1978, whilst he was in Mexico, Parrige's Ossining property was burned to the ground. According to Philip Coppins, Parrige learned that he and those closest to him were under surveillance. It became clear that the reason for this was Parrige's meddling with so-called free energy. According to Alex Constantine, Parrige told Ira Einhorn that the CIA was responsible for this, and he added that Parrige was being purged from the agency and phased out of secret CIA military intelligence, EMF, ELF research and development that was highly prized by the CIA directors, Richard Helms' MK Ultra program. At an electromagnetic conference in September 1987, Parrige apparently said, "My house was burned down, I was shot at, they tried to kill me, they tried to eliminate me. Everything's classified and you can't say a goddamn thing about it. A tough situation. And you can't get any real information out of any government agency. And I know all of them that do the work. I know people who head the projects, etc. When they're in trouble, they usually come ask me, and they classify what I tell them. Insanity. Following the events at Assenning, he abandoned Lab 9, and he remained in Mexico until 1980. When he returned to America, he had no further contact with Lab 9. I wonder why. In 1982, Puharich was offered the post of ELF Research Director for the CIA. Supposedly, 2 CIA men came to his house in Delaplane, Virginia, apologising that the CIA had given him such a hard time. Andrea had declined the offer by saying, "I don't want to work for liars, thieves and murderers. Tell the CIA, thank you, no." According to Leslie R. Pastor in his piece, Actual Case Histories of Suppression Occurrences, in 1983, Puharich was granted a US patent for a method and apparatus for splitting water molecules. This method would reportedly split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen with a net energy gain. Puharich, being a friend of R.J. Reynolds, found support and protective acceptance until he fell into disfavour with David Rockefeller, ultimately necessitating him to seek protection from another friend, the then Mexican president. Puharich capitulated, acquiescing to Mr. Rockefeller's demands, promising not to engage in further water as fuel research, thereby stopping all attempts at a sanctioned assassination by the CIA. On January the 3rd, 1995, Puharich died after falling down the stairs in his South Carolina home. It's perhaps telling that the CIA declassified and approved for release documents seemingly revealing its sponsorship of the SRI experiments in the 1970s, less than 6 months after his death. And with that, I will take a break. We'll all have a drink and whatever, and then we'll come back. Thank you.
Let's have a wine.
Yeah.